Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Epic Comic Book Wednesday. This is a world's finest collaboration between Michael K Vaughan and myself, where we combine the forces of stately Vaughan Manor and Hyde Cottage to talk about the comic books on which we've wasted our youths, or comic book issues, or characters, or runs. It started out, as the name implies, on Mike's channel as just him doing a tour of his enormous collection of Marvel Epic collections, their full-color paperback reprint line that has some wonderful stuff in it and also lots and lots of crap in it, and he has it all. And I saw that years ago and thought, oh, that seems nice, I'll horn my way in. So I did. He very graciously allowed me to horn my way in, but in exchange, he gets to pick what we talk about every week. And I think this week is an indulgence of him indulging me, because he has picked this week to spotlight a subject matter that I introduced into Epic Comic Book Wednesday. I've been railing against this subject matter ever since I gave it its name and described its parameters, probably 60 years ago, something like that. The Stan Lee virus is what I call Stan Lee's vision of superhero comic books, which of course can't be gainsaid, because when he created this vision in the 1960s, and then launched Marvel Comics and the modern era of comics, just in general, it was an enormous success. So the vision that he started out with there and clarified as he went along, if you're going to gainsay it, and I am going to gainsay it, you're going to be a lone voice crying out in the wilderness. I know this already. It has totally conquered the superhero world. All it took for Marvel Comics, all it took for their competitors, DC Comics, to see how popular this approach was before they started adopting it themselves. And of course, it's all over the movies. When Stan Lee created this vision of comic books in the early 1960s, no one imagined that a Marvel cinematic franchise would come along and make $30 billion. $30 billion with a B. That was totally unimaginable. That was the United States gross national budget at the time. There's no denying success, but nevertheless, I hate it, and I think it is at heart the problem with a lot of what's wrong with comic books today. There's a lot wrong with comic books today. We'll get to that. But first, I should define what I'm talking about. What Stan Lee originally what he envisioned in the 1960s was a few things. One, his comics would be reflecting what he referred to as the world outside your window. So there would be grumpy cab drivers. There would be recession. If there's recession in the news, there would be recession in the Marvel Universe. There'd be rent. Characters would have non-idyllic lives. Also, he imagined that since most of these characters are fighting bad guys in Lower Manhattan, they'll all know each other. And if something happens in one comic, it might have an effect in another comic. He didn't always abide by that rule. It wasn't always possible, even though he was writing everything and was increasingly bossing around the guys who were drawing everything. Even though that was true, sometimes he himself liked the isolated dramatics of having just one core cast of characters deal with something. So even though that was his vision for comic books, he would often have Thor, in Journey into Mystery, would face an extraterrestrial world-conquering threat. And there wouldn't be any other heroes around. Even though Stan Lee created this idea and promulgated it, in those early years, there wouldn't be any other heroes around. Thor would face it on its own. Or a character who is, brainwashing all of Manhattan from a water cooler tower. That would be a problem for Daredevil to face. It, of course, wouldn't be. If Stan Lee had had the courage of his convictions right from the beginning, it wouldn't be. Daredevil would, in fact, be one of the last people that you would have do it. A whole bunch of superheroes live in New York. They'd all converge on that water tower. And probably most famously of all, probably the most infamous example is Fantastic Four number 50, where Fantastic Four faces Galactus, a giant super space god who likes to eat planets and who has set up his cutlery and is putting on his napkin to eat Earth. The Fantastic Four fight a doomed losing battle against Galactus. They're eventually joined by the Silver Surfer, but no one can beat Galactus. And there are no other heroes around. In that original storyline, by that point, Marvel had plenty of other superhero teams going. And some of them might have been effective. Who knows how effective Professor X would have been, unleashed at his full capacity against the mind of Galactus. Certainly Doctor Strange. Much, much later on, a fan favorite creator of comic books named John Byrne, who we'll get to, uh, had Galactus return to Earth specifically so that he could see what it looks like to have all of those original Marvel heroes fight Galactus. And they beat him rather easily. Of course, a decade after that, or just a few years after that Fantastic Four issue where they fight Galactus, Thor fights Galactus on his own and beats him. So it wasn't perfectly executed at first, but it was nevertheless the idea. These stories are taking place in a shared continuity. These characters all know each other, and they know each other's previous adventures. So that was Stan Lee's vision, but it became the Stan Lee virus because all it ultimately does is sicken things. That's all it does. Viruses, like I mentioned when I've talked about the Stan Lee virus, both to friends in dormitories and to college amphitheaters in Hilo, Hawaii, and also here on BookTube. Whenever I've talked about it, I've always said some low-grade viral infections, when you get them, they do have, it's hard to think about it this way, but they do have some positive effects. They're ultimately going to be negative, but they can have some short-term positive effects along the way. And that is true of Stan Lee's original vision of Marvel, of comic books. These superheroes are real people, that they have real identifiable problems, that they live in the real identifiable world. That had some positives along the way. There are things to praise about what became the Stan Lee virus. Once it jumps from host to host, there were no other writers at Marvel Comics when he originated this whole idea, so you really couldn't call it a virus. It was still contained in its native population, but soon it was jumping the species barrier. Soon it was in other comics. Soon other people will write comics this way, including, disastrously, DC Comics, the home of all the real superheroes. Disastrous. But before it really started wreaking havoc, it did have some short-term positive effects. You can point to great comic books, great comic book runs, great comic book stories that are great largely because of what later became the Stan Lee virus. You can do that. For instance, I have always said the Stan Lee virus inevitably leads to death. Inevitably, you're going to get writers who are just lazy, or they're hungover, or they're pressed for time, and they want to engage with the Stan Lee virus. And the ultimate stakes of the Stan Lee virus is to kill somebody, is to kill a character. Stan Lee himself comes close to doing that in the first recorded instance of the bad side of the Stan Lee virus. In an early episode, in an early issue of the Avengers, Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp, is shot. Seriously wounded. She has to be rushed to the hospital. The Avengers are pretty sure she might not live. She's not zapped by a ray gun. She doesn't have any kind of amorphous injury. She can shrink to insect size, but she's at full size in a bad guy's hangout, and one of it, just a normal thug, shoots her with a normal gun. I remember vividly seeing that and thinking, sooner or later, everybody's going to die. Because that's where this goes. You can't stop it from going there. You might not do it. Stan Lee might not do it. But some less talented writer will. And inevitably they did. And even then, even in that ultimate exponent of the Stan Lee virus, you could still get really good stories. The Fantastic Four became a family. Reed Richards and Sue Storm married. They had a wedding. The wedding issue is a fantastic comic book. They had a baby. These are flagrant examples of the Stan Lee virus. It wasn't that Reed and Sue were bickering and flirting with each other and will they or won't they literally forever, like you would get in a real comic book. Instead, it progressed. They went from a vaguely father and daughter relationship to combat colleagues to seriously in love with each other to married to having a child. It even went so far in later incarnations to having a second child, kind of, sort of, and also divorce. The subject of divorce came up, and so on and so forth, and also extramarital affairs. All of that stuff started to come up, and some of it made good stories. Also, when we're talking about death, well, an amazing milestone in superhero comic books is the death of Gwen Stacy, Peter Parker's girlfriend in The Amazing Spider-Man. People always forget that there's a crap issue right before it, and there's a crap issue right after it. even the writer at the time of that wasn't Stan Lee, but even that writer really didn't have a sure footing. He just knew, well, I've got the Stan Lee virus. All of my readers have it now. They're going to want something. You have to keep up in the ante, and the only way you can go is death. Actually, there is one place you can go beyond death with the Stan Lee virus, and that is desecration of the dead. And that happens often. That has happened often as a result of this virus. Also, I might want to use, in terms of positive effects of the Stan Lee virus, you could look backwards, and you could also look forward. I'm thinking the death of Gwen Stacy is kind of a staple example that I use. But if you look backwards, even to real comic books, sort of a prototypical version of the Stan Lee virus is change at all. Change that is meant to be permanent at all. Always got my dander up. I always wrote in a letter. I typed out a letter and fired it off to New York whenever I saw change that was meant to be permanent, even when I loved it. It's possible that my great-great-grandfather used his chubby little kid fingers to type out with one finger a letter about how I love the fact that Superboy has a dog, but there weren't supposed to be any other survivors of Krypton, except in the Phantom Zone. So I love the fact that he has a dog, and clearly the dog is a beagle. But, and then later, slightly older fingers of my great-great-grandfather typed a letter saying, Supergirl? I mean, yes, you've done this in an utterly charming way, an iconic cover for when Superman reveals her existence to the world, but she's just a girl version of him. Doesn't that decrease the uniqueness of the character? So those are older examples. But you can also look, you obviously can't gainsay those because those result in a lot of fun. Those two characters being introduced results in a lot of fun. But you could also move forward in time if you want to stick with Superman. Much, much more forward in time, you have a storyline in which Superman reveals his secret identity to Lois Lane after 60 years of that just being static. And then they have a baby. They have a son. And one of the few universal reactions in all of comic fandom, there are very few. For instance, this man, this monster is not universal because I'm the one person who thinks it's ham-handed dude bro stuff. But the Walt Simonson run on Thor is a really good example of complete universality. Every comic book fan who's ever looked at it thinks it is great, perhaps the greatest run on Thor. Likewise, every comic book fan out there loves the period of time when Superman and Lois Lane were mother and father to a small boy. They love that. Superman as a father, I didn't think it would work. I was poised to type a letter, but I didn't think it would work, but it did. It absolutely did. It did not make his character himself feel old or out of touch. It was wonderful. It was a side of Superman we'd waited a long time to see, and somewhere along the line, somebody had the genius idea that permanent change would be good, not bad, and it was true. Absolutely worked. So there are positives here, but ultimately you're going to get negatives. Because when you make your comic books mutable like that, when you make them responsive to whim like that, because killing a character is a whim. Every major character death in comic books has been done on a whim. Supergirl, the aforementioned Supergirl, was killed in issue number 7 of Crisis on Infinite Earths, infamously on a whim. There had been a little too much beer flowing when creators were together, and they decided, let's just kill her. And so on and so forth. And every desecration of the dead has also been a whim. None of it has been carefully planned. None of it has been. With maybe one exception, one of the standard lines in even the Stan Lee universe was that nobody dies but Bucky and Uncle Ben. So Peter Parker's uncle, Ben, is shot dead, and that is the motivation for Peter Parker to become Spider-Man. And Captain America's World War II teenage sidekick, Bucky, dies in the war. So far as I know, no one has ever brought back Uncle Ben. But Bucky did come back, and the writer who did that, did carefully plan it. He came back as Winter Soldier. He's a popular character now. He's not going anywhere. I think myself that it was a mistake. It removes any tragedy from Captain America. He lost no one in World War II. World War II is just another thing that happened to him because, unlike anyone else in his generation, he didn't lose anybody. But nevertheless, Winter Soldier can be done well as a character. Usually, desecrations of the dead are not so good. Usually they are absolutely terrible. In current DC continuity, Jor-El, the father of Superman, is alive and crazy. That is that obviously needs to be completely retconned. Also, that little boy that Superman and Lois Lane have as a son, a plot MacGuffin connected with crazy old Jor-El ages him quickly from a boy to a teenager, specifically so that the writers could have him come out as gay. So you get stuff like that because the Stan Lee virus has laid the groundwork. The Stan Lee virus is, we've got to keep upping the ante. These things are plastic, they are not eternal, and every writer that comes along can just stretch and rip this thing any way they like. So you get a new writer to come along on Green Arrow or the Fantastic Four or whatever. They're not going to be told anymore, you can't, here's a list of things you can't do. Once upon a time, that new writer coming onto World's Finest, for instance, where Superman teams up with Batman, would have been given a long list of things they cannot do. And that list would have been given to them in an office where you show up on time and you can't wear your pajamas and you can't slurp frappuccinos at your desk, and the men who are giving you your orders are wearing neckties, and if you break those, you're fired. You're gone. Okay, I gave you this list. I made sure you said that you understood it. You're giving me this. Okay, not only am I not going to use this, but you're fired. Pack up your stuff and leave. There wouldn't be any second opinions. There wouldn't be any social media flame campaigns. You'd just be gone because your employer gave you conditions and you broke them. Like, for instance, in the good old days of World's Finest, one of those conditions on that informal list, I don't think it was ever actually a list, but one of those conditions was that Superman must never simply show up Batman. Batman and Robin must contribute something to the story that Superman couldn't contribute himself. No writer ever broke that, because if you did, you'd get a stern talking to or you'd get fired. The difference here, and the subject of the Stan Lee virus inevitably morphs into the failure of comic books today. The Stan Lee virus is not the only thing that's responsible, but it laid the groundwork. The difference today is that no one goes to work today alone in a corporation. No one does. They go to work with their lawyer. And as a result, around 2014, 2015, Marvel Comics especially, but they also infested DC Comics, started doing diversity hires. They started looking around under fear of social media scolding from random strangers, 12 random strangers. It wouldn't affect them at all, but for some reason, corporations became deathly afraid. Around 2014 or 2015, they looked around and thought, well, we need X, Y, and Z external characteristics in our workforce, and we don't have them. So we're going to go out and hire those external characteristics. We absolutely do not care whether or not those external characteristics come with any internal characteristics that we actually need. We don't care if you can write. We're not hiring you as a writer because you can write. We're hiring you as a writer because you're a Filipino in a wheelchair. And you've weaponized that identity on social media, and will weaponize it against us if you apply for the job, we ask you what your experience is, you say I don't have any, and we say no thanks. Then if we say that, then you will drag our name through the mud on social media, and for some reason a multi-million-dollar corporation is afraid of that. So we're going to hire you for those characteristics. We're going to hire, of course, we're not going to hire any more straight people. Of course, we're not going to hire any more white men. They're just not going to work in the industry anymore. We will go elsewhere, even though the people we're going elsewhere to are acting like spasmodic, psychotic juveniles online and show absolutely no indication to stop acting that way, even when they're acting in our name, in the name of our company. We know, in other words, that they're a hot, steaming mess. We're going to hire them anyway because they have external qualities that we want. Those people, of course, they are not exponents of the Stan Lee virus because they don't read comic books. Never have. Absolutely never have. When you see a diversity hire in an interview, the ones that still give them, saying how they grew up with, I grew up with the comics. I love them so much. I've been a comic book geek my whole life. They are obviously lying. Usually, the industry shill reporters who just want to come up with a padded piece for some journal will not press them. It would be easy to determine that they're lying. All you have to do is ask them one question. Just ask them one specific question about anything to do with superhero comics, and they won't know the answer. And that will be that. They don't know anything about the characters that they have been given, but because of the Stan Lee virus, they feel like, well, the whole point here is to push the envelope, so that's what we'll do. And they started doing that in 2014, 2015, especially turbocharged in 2016. I wonder why. And it took two forms. Their turbocharging of the Stan Lee virus took two forms. One was to make the comics they were writing and drawing unrecognizable. So you have a comic book called Iron Man, but it's a teenage black girl with an enormous afro. She'd be completely blind if she put a helmet on over her head. She'd be completely blinded by her own hair. You have a comic book called The Hulk, but he's an Asian teenager, and he's rad. You have a comic book called The Avengers, staffed from front to back with D-listers. You have a comic book called Thor, but it's not Thor, it's Jane Foster, who's calling herself Thor. And Thor himself is a multiple amputee, dysfunctional alcoholic belching in the back of the bar somewhere. You have a comic book called Captain America, but it's not Captain America. It's Sam Wilson, who is called the Falcon. Only he's wearing Captain America's outfit and carrying Captain America's shield. And so on down the line, just incredibly down the line. You give Iceman of the X-Men his own comic book, but it's not Iceman. It's a weird, flaming gay version of Iceman who is not a gay character. And so on and so forth, just endlessly. Send Superman into space, tell the world, have the world say that his gay son is Superman, and have them just call him Superman. And for issue after issue, with people that he saves when he bothers to save them. Usually these new versions of characters don't bother to help anybody. They are perfect reflections of their creators. Usually they spend their time on social media, eating, talking about eating, and also complaining. They almost never help anybody. But in that brief run of Superman, son of Kal-El, he would swoop down to save people from a collapsing bridge, set them into safety, and they'd say, "Thanks, Superman." And none of those characters know, all those characters know he's not Superman. They can look at him and see that. They never ask. They never say, "Hey, where's the guy we grew up with?" No characters ever do that, because the creators want to say what they always say in circumstances like this, which is not just, "This is the new reality." You may have seen this in the trans debate. They don't just say, "This is the new reality." They almost always then follow it up with saying, "This has always been the new reality. Didn't you notice?" It's called gaslighting. And they universally did that in these books, but they didn't just do that. That was one half of what they did. The other half of what they did was the aforementioned abominably juvenile behavior on social media, which they started directing against the fans of their books. When they started getting complaints about how, this Iron Man comic book is $3.99 and Iron Man's not in it. And those fans weren't convinced when that creator turned around and said, "Sure, Iron Man's in it. Iron Man is Ironheart. She always has been. Didn't you notice?" Instead, those fans wrote and posted and made videos saying, "No, we did know. You don't have any idea what you're talking about. What do you mean, didn't we notice? You changed this yesterday, and it stinks. Please change it back. Kindly change it back. Kindly change all of these characters back. We don't want any of this crap that you're pushing. Kindly change it back. You creating innovative storylines, fine. We're okay with that. Fundamentally changing the comics that we've been reading our whole lives, no, we're not okay with that. So change it back, please." And when that kind of thing was said, those creators excoriated their own fans on social media, and they were not fired for doing so. They kept their jobs. Their editorial bosses thought, well, I don't want them criticizing me on social media, so I'll look the other way when they criticize our paying customer base on social media. That had an unbelievably predictable result. It drove away that core buying audience. It drove them away. They didn't like being called Nazis. They didn't like being called Islamophobes or sexists or racists or anything like that. They didn't like being called that when it wasn't true. You came, you vandalized their favorite characters, and when they didn't like it, you called them names. So they left. They had no choice. There wasn't anything else they could do, so they left. They took their money with them, which is why today superhero comic books don't sell. Spider-Man, the Amazing Spider-Man, for 50 years, the flagship of Marvel Comics, ships maybe 20,000 issues, 20,000 copies of an issue, but that's just the number they ship from the warehouse. That is not the number sold. The number sold is a fraction of that. I bet no more than 5,000 issues of Spider-Man are sold on any month, no matter who the creative team is. because there aren't enough fans left anymore. The people who would have bought it are gone, and they have burned their bridges. They don't care at all what's going on with Spider-Man because they know better than to be lured back. It won't work. You will pull something. These creators will pull something the minute they're lured back, and they know it. It's a bad, bad break, and of course the industry can't sustain it. The industry can't sustain that break. No industry can. If you have an industry, no matter what it is, and you intentionally target the bulk of your paying audience for years, so that audience leaves, well, you don't have a reserve paying audience. Nobody does. The creators, the weird blue-haired Twitter-addicted creators who did all of this alienating, assured their editorial bosses that they did have an alternate audience. There's an alternate audience out there of downtrodden, what are hilariously called marginalized communities, who will buy this stuff in droves once they see characters exactly like themselves in our pages. It didn't happen. Hollywood tried this before comic books, and it resoundingly did not happen. Comic books had an example to go by. They ignored it and did it themselves, and it didn't happen. That phantom audience either is not there or does not have any money. Amazingly, Hollywood still has not learned that lesson. They are still trying this sort of crap. They know the phantom audience they were counting on does not exist. They're still putting out material for that audience instead of for the audience they've alienated. But comic book creators thoroughly alienated their audience. So that Spider-Man, the X-Men, these things don't sell. These comic books are made, these professionals are paid. They're paid very little unless they have real name recognition. But they do the work. These things come out. They're very professional looking, but they don't sell. They sink out of nowhere because the core audience is gone. And the core audience isn't gone because they've migrated organically to manga. That's not it. They didn't migrate organically. They were intentionally ostracized. And so, when we're talking about the Stan Lee virus, if you want to fix things, if you want, for some reason, if you wanted to fix monthly superhero comic books, there are a few steps you can take. There are 5 steps. Step number 1 is absolutely unavoidable, and this is true if you're running a movie studio. This is true if you're watching the radicalization of the Republican Party. This is true if you're running a TV show, a radio station, superhero comics, no matter what it is. Step number 1 is you have to fire all of your diversity hires. Anyone anywhere in the organization that you hired for the reasons that I mentioned, because of external qualities instead of internal qualities. Every single one of those people has to be fired. It is not enough for you to fire one. You need to fire all of them. They are a collective creature. They are a hive mind. There's no individuality there. So you have to get rid of all of them. And that means, the they, them who's sorting papers in the mailroom and never touches anything creative, that person also has to go. All of them have to go. Every diversity hire has to be fired. You can't switch them around. You have to march them out of the building. They all have to be gone, even if it means that you take such a hit with your personnel that you have to issue a bulletin saying there won't be any superhero comics this month. We'll be back better than ever next month. Even if it means that, you still have to do that. You can't leave even one in place. Because they never change, they never forgive, and they communicate with each other by pheromones or whatever. So you have to get rid of them all. That's step number 1. They all have to go. Sooner or later, if companies haven't just become communist, if companies actually want to make money, sooner or later they're all going to learn that. DC Comics or Disney films, sooner or later they're all going to learn that. Step number 1 is completely unavoidable. They all have to go. They had no business being in the operation anyway. They all have to go. Step number 2 is to once they're gone, immediately retcon every change they made. These changes fall under the rough heading of social justice warrior changes, SJW changes. You have to immediately retcon all of those changes in comic books or in movies or TV or whatever. Retconning means you have to create a storyline that removes that change. You have to remove that change, whatever it is. So if, for instance, Jane Foster is Thor, you have to stop her from being Thor. That plot line has to end right away. In the extreme case here, it would mean you have to retcon Clark Kent's son being a teenager. The only reason that young John Kent was aged up to a teenager really fast is because the ideologues who were in control of the character wanted to make him gay, and the one thing they haven't managed to do yet is make a kid gay. So he couldn't be a little boy. He had to be a teenager for that to happen, and that's why it happened. I would say if you're getting rid of those people, get rid of teenage John Kent. Have him be back to being an 8-year-old. Same thing as his counterpart in the Batman universe, little Damian Wayne. Have them be boys again. I would say that, but certainly all the rest of it, if you're familiar with superhero comics, then you know the changes that I'm talking about that need to be made. Iceman is not gay. There have been 50 attempts like that on the part of these blue-haired activist creators to just mess with the fans they hate so much. So we've got this character. He's extremely, well, I don't know, masculine, tough. We have broken him completely. We've made him a disgrace. We've made him laughable. That would need to change. All of those changes, all the things we could roughly group under SJW changes, all need to be retconned. No matter where it is. I mean, I'm talking about comic books now, but you could extend this to anywhere, just anywhere. And you should also absolutely forbid any SJW changes going forward because they are going to lose you money. I'm not even talking about respecting the work of creators that came before. I'm talking just business. They're going to lose you money. These changes are going to lose you money. So you have to retcon that in the first 5 minutes of a Terminator movie, John Connor is shot in the head and killed because a tiny little woman is going to take control of the franchise. You have to retcon that. That, of course, didn't happen. It doesn't matter that you want to give a vaguely ethnic 5-foot-tall girl the lead in an action film. You still have to retcon it. Just gone. That change has to be gone. Doctor Who, the same way. The Forever Child that had the first female Doctor be not only the first female Doctor, but also the ultimate Doctor and the source of everything that has ever been in connection with Doctor Who or the planet Gallifrey or Time Lords or anything. Literally the girl who's the key to everything. That episode has to be retconned. You have to just get rid of it. There's no way to live with it. You have to just get rid of it. Same thing with a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of these changes. They all have to go. Then step number 3 is going to be a little bit on the awkward side, but it necessarily has to happen if we're get back to just talking about comic books. Also, when we come to SJW changes, it means you can't do any of them in the future either. The enormous drive to make Captain America gay. You have to, well, the people who are making that drive have been fired by now, if you're following my 5-step plan. You have to snip that idea in the bud. Just get rid of it. There's an enormous drive to make Lois Lane a lesbian. You have to get rid of that. That has to just be gone. She can't experiment. She can't have any idea of that. That is not her character. Her character is almost a century old. Lots of creators more talented than you went into creating that character. You can't just change it to score points with 12 weirdos on Twitter. Or also proposed changes. Like, for instance, I don't know how many of you have heard of a couple of proposed changes in The Wind. A new version of Scott Pilgrim. Some of you may be familiar with the utterly charming movie with Michael Cera. In the new Scott Pilgrim, he is killed early on, and it's Ramona who fights her ex-boyfriends. Of course, if you follow my 5-step plan, the people who are proposing that change have been fired. So they're not around anymore. You just need to put out a press release saying we're of course not going to do that. Same thing with the latest news, which is that the Silver Surfer in the Marvel Comics, the Disney version of Fantastic Four, will be a woman. If you're following my plan, the people who put that idea forward are gone already. You just have to put out a press release saying we're of course not going to do that. We're not going to desecrate your long-term favorite characters by willy-nilly changing them just to irritate you. We're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. And that brings us to step number 3, which is that in addition to those press releases, you would probably need to apologize. You need to win your paying customers back. If Spider-Man is only selling at 3,000 or 4,000 issues a month, then you have a serious problem. A serious problem. You could have Spider-Man selling 40,000 copies a month, but you can't do that if you've alienated your core fan base, the people who are going to buy these issues. You don't have a phantom audience. You have one core audience, and you've alienated, you've driven them away, and you did it, you allowed your creators to do it very consciously. So you might need to apologize. You certainly need to make overt overtures. We want you back. Please try Marvel Comics again. We want you back. You certainly need to do that. I think maybe an apology or two would be in order. We're sorry about the direction of our last 10 years. Please come back and give us another try. We are listening to you now. I bet that might work. A lot of the people who stop buying Marvel Comics or DC Comics miss it. they missed that part of their life. They might be willing to come back. Then step number 4 is to get back to the Stan Lee virus itself. That, what I was talking about for steps 1 through 3 is a vector of the Stan Lee virus. This weird suicidal change in popular entertainment. I won't even say it's just comic books. It's everything. It's Charlie's Angels. It's Ghostbusters, of course, infamously. It's Terminator. It's Predator. It's Aliens. It's the Marvel Comics TV shows on Disney Plus. It's anything, Doctor Who. It's anything that you can name. So I'm not talking just about that, but if we get back away from that vector to just the Stan Lee virus itself, well, you would want to come back. The last 2 steps would be ways to fix the Stan Lee virus, to get things back to Superboy as a muscular teenager in skin-tight leotard fighting bank robbers in Smallville in the 1950s. Occasionally dealing with an extraterrestrial being who crash lands on Earth. Some wacky stuff that happens. He's a little bit confused at first over what it is. He figures it out. There's a happy ending. In order to get back to that, step number 4 would be that you immediately stop interconnected stories. So Stan Lee's idea that all these characters live in the same universe and are just up the street from each other, where Peter Parker on a date with Mary Jane can walk past Doctor Strange's Bleecker Street mansion, that has to stop. That has to stop. So no crossovers. If aliens are invading Earth and pounding the daylights out of Paradise Island, it's Wonder Woman's problem. Maybe Wonder Girl's problem. But it isn't the Justice League's problem. It isn't Superman's problem because they don't know what's happening. It's not their book. So that's one thing. In other words, that and also multi-part stories have to be extremely rare. Extremely rare for there to be a cliffhanger where it looks like Batman is in trouble and you have to buy the next issue to find out. That should be extremely rare. It should be one and done storylines. If you have writers coming forward, whether they have blue hair or not, whether they eat kale or not, if they're coming forward to you and saying, well, there's no way to tell an effective story like that, what they're doing is telling you not to hire them. They're not telling you anything about what can or cannot be done in a comic book story. They're telling you that they can't do the job. Well, listen to them. Listen to them. Don't hire them. If they say that, don't hire them. Also, in reference to the aforementioned John Byrne, if they come to you and say, well, I'll happily write this character, but he has to be a lot less powerful. If he's this powerful, no one can tell any good stories about him. Okay, you have just told me that you are not qualified. Thanks, we'll go with somebody else. So that's step number 4. No interconnected universe, no characters know each other, unless the purpose of the book is that they know each other. The Justice League, they all know each other because they're all teaming up every month. But in their own stories, no. No special guest stars, no to be continued, no nothing like that. And then the 5th step to fix this it's not technically connected with Stan Lee virus, but I think it aids it. It amplifies it. And that is the way you get your comic books. Once upon a time, comic books were open to general readership. And general readership, normal people, don't want gigantic crossover events. They don't want every single female character in either Marvel or DC revealed as lesbian. They don't want that. It's not that they're bigots. It's not that they're homophobes. It's that they know these characters and they don't want all this hoopla. They want an adventure. I want to buy an adventure of this character. It can be a really good adventure. It can be incredible. But it can't have all these tendrils launching off elsewhere. And the reason that superhero comics are able to get away with doing all these multi-issue events and gigantic crossovers is because they were no longer selling to the general audience and they knew it. Somehow or other along the way, it struck the industry as a good idea that your superhero comics would only be available at comic book shops. Licensed comic book shops, a place where only the uber nerd fans are going to go. No normal person would ever darken the doorsteps. They're where you can get comics. You suddenly can't get them at drugstores, can't get them at individual issues at just a spinner rack at Walmart or in bookstores or anything like that. You couldn't do that anymore. And so these things were only being issued to specialist readers who the readers who are all in, a lot of them are going to be okay with multiple storylines. And how does Rachel Summers connect with Madeline Pryor? And what about this issue or this backup feature from? Settle down there, Seymour. Comic books could have a general audience. Back when they were selling 80,000 copies an issue, that was why, because they were selling to a general audience. So get rid of exclusive distributors like Diamond or whatever. Get rid of them. Sell these things, just distribute them through Ingram and sell them everywhere. Newsstands, bookstores, everywhere. You could still have a specialty comic book shop. Don't know how long they'd last. With competition, I don't know how long they'd last. And an institution of any kind, no matter how treasured it is, that folds the instant it has competition, is a bad institution. But maybe they would survive. But definitely you have to get rid of that, so that the lunatics aren't running the asylum. So there you go. Sorry, I'm sorry to go on at length here, but that is my treatment of the Stan Lee virus and its vectors. There is a way to save the comic book industry. Unfortunately, I know a lot about the people who are involved in this mess, and they are ideologues. They are religious zealots. It is a religion, and they are zealots, which means they don't care about money, and they don't care about sales. They don't care about success, and every time they are criticized, they view it as a mark of honor, a scourging on the way to Golgotha. That's how they view it. So even if somebody adopted the rest of these steps, number 3 will certainly not happen, and all these steps need to happen. But number 3 certainly will not. None of these people, if they're left in power, they'll never apologize for anything. Never. So it doesn't matter. But in a dream world, that's how we would get back to Superboy and his dog fighting bank robbers in Smallville. And isn't that where we all want to be? Anyway, that's the Stan Lee virus. I don't know if Michael K. Vaughan is going to indulge me twice, so who knows what we'll do next week. We only have a couple more Epic Comic Wednesdays before I disappear for the year, so we will see. We'll see how we'll ring out the year. But I'm going to wrap this up for now. I've gone on way too long, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.